I never thought a whisper could make my heart stop, until she leaned in and dared me to touch her. It started as a normal morning, the office quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the occasional ring of a phone. I was focused on my tasks, unaware that today would feel different, heavier in a way I couldn't yet name. She walked in, my boss's assistant, and everything shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. She moved with that effortless grace she always had, confident but not overbearing, like someone who knew the world was hers yet didn't need to prove it. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she passed by my desk, close enough that I felt the air stir around me. The faint scent of her perfume drifted into my senses, warm, slightly floral, comforting yet provocative in its subtlety. It was a scent I didn't notice before, or maybe I just never allowed myself to notice. As she handed me a stack of files, her fingers brushed mine for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet my skin seemed to remember it long after she walked away. There was a pause in the air between us, unspoken but loaded with something I couldn't put into words, a connection, or perhaps a question. My pulse quickened, and I found myself glancing up just in time to catch her eyes, briefly meeting mine. There was a spark there, small but persistent, like a flame flickering in a draft. Her eyes held a kind of quiet amusement, as if she was aware of the effect she had and was letting me realize it slowly, teasingly. I looked away too quickly, embarrassed, but not before noticing the way her lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't playful, exactly, and it wasn't flirtatious in the obvious way. It was something more, subtle, deliberate, and incredibly unsettling in the most thrilling way. All morning, I found my thoughts drifting back to that moment. The way her hair fell over her shoulder, the soft warmth of her hand against mine, the teasing light in her eyes, it was all still there, lingering like a song you can't get out of your head. I wondered if she even noticed the effect she had on me, or if it was just the way she naturally moved through the world. Either way, it left me restless, acutely aware of every sound, every movement around me. By lunch, I caught myself hoping for another brief encounter, another casual touch, another glance that carried more meaning than words could express. And though I tried to focus, the memory of that morning, the subtle brush of her fingers, the warmth in her gaze, followed me like a shadow, leaving me both anxious and exhilarated, unsure of where it might lead, but unable to stop thinking about it. It was the kind of moment that changes everything quietly, without fireworks or confessions. Just a touch, a look, and a question suspended between us that neither of us dared to answer, yet. The days after that morning passed with a quiet tension I couldn't shake. We exchanged the usual greetings, shared small smiles, and yet every interaction seemed to carry a hidden weight. It wasn't overt, not at all. It was the kind of thing you felt in the spaces between words, in the pauses and glances that lasted just a second too long. One afternoon, she invited me to grab a coffee while the office emptied around us. The corridor felt warmer with her there, the fluorescent lights softened somehow, and her presence made everything else fade into the background. We walked side by side, the subtle rhythm of our steps strangely comforting, yet charged with unspoken curiosity. She asked about my weekend plans casually, but there was a genuine softness in her tone, a real interest that made me relax without even realizing it. And when I returned the question, asking about hers, she hesitated for a heartbeat, just enough that I noticed the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Nothing much," she said lightly, but I sensed layers she wasn't ready to share. That hint of something private made me lean in slightly, just to be closer, and our shoulders brushed. A spark went through me, electric and unspoken. We found a quiet corner in the small cafeteria, away from the leftover chatter of a few late workers. She spoke about her day, the small victories and annoyances, and I listened, not just with my ears but with a kind of attentive care that surprised even me. There was something about the way she described her life, the calm confidence paired with subtle self-consciousness, that made me want to know more. I realized she trusted me more than I'd expected, and it felt like a gift. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, and without thinking, I met her eyes. They held mine longer than necessary, warm and steady, and I caught a faint blush rising along her cheeks. The air between us thickened, carrying the faint scent of her perfume, now mingled with the comforting aroma of coffee. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for her cup, not accidental, I could tell, and the brief touch lingered just long enough to make my heart skip. Throughout the conversation, there was a rhythm forming, words, pauses, laughter, and quiet glances. Every so often, she leaned closer to hear me better, her shoulder almost grazing mine, and I felt the magnetic pull of her presence. It wasn't bold or forward, it was patient, a gentle insistence that made every small touch, every exchange look, feel monumental. By the time we returned to our desks, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and calm. The world seemed a little sharper, brighter, and yet somehow heavier with anticipation. I realized, as I watched her walk away, that I was beginning to notice everything: the tilt of her head, the way her hair caught the light, the subtle way she smiled when she thought no one was watching. That afternoon, a simple coffee break became a turning point. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it planted a seed, a quiet, insistent awareness that something more was growing between us. And with each small conversation, each fleeting touch, that seed rooted itself deeper, leaving me both anxious and eager for the next time I'd be near her. It was late afternoon, the office unusually quiet as most of the staff had already left. The soft hum of the air conditioning mixed with the faint tapping of keyboards, a rhythm that usually lulled me into focus. Today, though, I couldn't concentrate. She had been near me all morning, moving with her usual grace, and every glance she threw in my direction made my chest tighten in ways I didn't fully understand. I was organizing some papers at my desk when she appeared beside me, leaning just enough to peer at what I was doing. Her presence was magnetic, and I felt it in the way my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the next folder. She didn't speak at first, just watched with those quiet, intelligent eyes that seemed to see far more than I ever revealed. The air between us shifted, thick and charged, though the office remained silent and indifferent to our private tension. Then, almost casually, she leaned in closer. I realized only when her hair brushed my cheek that she was dangerously close, too close for anything ordinary. My pulse raced, my ears caught every subtle sound of her breath, every infinitesimal shift in her posture. Her face was inches from mine, warm and luminous in the soft afternoon light filtering through the blinds. She murmured it then, just above a whisper, almost playful but laced with something deeper. "I dare you to touch me." The words sent a shock through me that had nothing to do with volume. The softness of her voice, the teasing tone, the way it brushed against my ear like a feather, it made me hyper-aware of every inch of space between us. My mind screamed caution, professionalism, boundaries. Yet every instinct, every suppressed longing, urged me to lean in, to respond, to feel that spark turn into something tangible. I froze, caught between disbelief and desire, the world narrowing until only her presence mattered. Her lips were so close that I could see the curve, the way they caught the light, and I imagined the warmth, the softness, the promise that lingered in that tiny, daring challenge. My hands itched to reach out, but restraint anchored me, reminding me that this was forbidden, thrilling in its very impossibility. She straightened slightly, but the sparkle in her eyes never faded. The faint smile tugging at her lips suggested she had anticipated my hesitation, that she found it amusing. Her confidence was intoxicating, yet there was a subtle vulnerability too, like she was daring me not to just obey the words but to understand the meaning behind them. I exhaled slowly, trying to regain composure, but the electricity lingered, settling into the hollow of my chest. Every glance she gave after that, every casual brush of her hand as she returned a document, felt heavier, more deliberate. I couldn't erase the echo of her whisper, couldn't unfeel the weight of her proximity. That moment changed everything. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a promise, but it was the spark that ignited something unspoken, a tension suspended between desire and restraint. From then on, every interaction carried the memory of that whisper, a private game only we understood, leaving me both exhilarated and anxious for what might come next. The office felt heavier after that whisper. Everything seemed sharper, every sound, every flicker of movement, every faint scent in the air. I tried to return to my tasks, to focus on spreadsheets and emails, but my mind kept replaying the words she had breathed near my ear. I dare you to touch me. I couldn't decide whether it was a game, a test, or something more genuine. Every rational part of me warned against reading too much into it, reminded me of professionalism, boundaries, the wide gap between us. Yet, deep in my chest, a quiet pull kept insisting I notice her differently now, that nothing would feel the same after this. She moved through the office as if nothing had happened. Confident, poised, calm. She smiled at others, laughed lightly at a joke, carried herself with the same natural grace I had always admired. And yet, to me, she seemed to radiate something entirely new, something intimate and private, almost daring me to catch it. Every casual brush of her hand against a file or a chair felt like a whisper of that earlier moment, an unspoken reminder of the tension we shared. I noticed her in ways I hadn't before. The soft tilt of her head when she listened, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle curve of her lips when she wasn't aware I was watching. I caught myself lingering too long in her presence, stealing glances, imagining her leaning closer again, imagining her warm breath on my skin. My chest ached with anticipation and restraint. Even small gestures made my heart stutter. When she offered me a pen and our fingers brushed, I felt a spark that lingered long after the contact. When she leaned over a desk to show me something, my senses sharpened, the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth radiating from her arm, the closeness that made my pulse thrum. Every ordinary interaction became charged with meaning I couldn't ignore. I couldn't tell anyone about it. I couldn't speak of the fluttering in my chest, or the ache of longing that accompanied every casual encounter. I carried it silently, replaying each nuance over and over, her voice, the brush of her hair, the teasing glimmer in her eyes. I began noticing things in myself, hesitation, restraint, longing. I began noticing things in her, subtle cues, the quiet way she lingered near me, the faint smiles that seemed just for me. By the end of the day, I realized I was caught in a strange, intoxicating limbo. She hadn't crossed any lines. I hadn't either. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. There was now an invisible thread between us, taut with possibility, and I was painfully aware of how delicate it was, how easily it could snap, or pull us closer. As I packed my bag, I caught her looking in my direction briefly, with that same unreadable expression. It made my chest tighten, a reminder that nothing had been said, nothing had been done, and yet everything had changed. The silent aftermath was heavier than any confession, more tantalizing than any overt gesture. And I knew, deep down, that the next encounter would be even more dangerous for my composure. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, warm stripes across the office floor. We were alone, the usual hum of activity replaced by a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. For the first time, the space between us felt less like a boundary and more like an invitation. The tension that had simmered for days wasn't blazing, it was steady, deliberate, like a heartbeat waiting to be acknowledged. We sat side by side at a small conference table, papers spread before us, but neither of us truly focused on the work. The conversation drifted effortlessly from mundane tasks to small glimpses of our lives beyond the office. She spoke about a childhood memory, her voice soft, tinged with nostalgia. I shared a fleeting thought about a recent weekend hike, a story I usually kept to myself. The ease between us surprised me, as if these moments had always been waiting for permission to exist. Then it happened. A silence fell over the table, not awkward, but intimate. I noticed her hand inch closer to mine, resting on the edge of the table. Her fingers were just a hair away from touching mine, yet the air between us felt dense with possibility. My heart raced as if it knew this was a turning point, and almost instinctively, my hand shifted. Our fingers met, lightly at first, and then lingered, exploring the warmth and subtle tension that neither of us had dared to name. The contact wasn't rushed, wasn't heavy-handed, it was deliberate and meaningful. Her palm was warm, soft against mine, and when she didn't pull away, a thrill ran through me. Every nerve seemed to hum in response to her closeness. I could feel the steady rhythm of her pulse under my fingers, a quiet, grounding warmth that made my chest tighten. It was the first real physical connection between us, yet it felt like something far greater than a simple touch. It was trust, it was recognition, it was unspoken understanding. We didn't speak at first. Words weren't necessary. The conversation existed in the space between our hands, in the lingering brush of skin, and the subtle brush of her sleeve against my arm. Her gaze met mine, steady, searching, inviting without demanding. I felt the weight of every unspoken thought, every suppressed longing, every question we hadn't dared to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I've never let anyone get this close before," she admitted, her eyes holding mine with a vulnerability she rarely allowed. My chest tightened further, and I found myself brushing her hand with my thumb, a slow, reassuring gesture. "You can't," I said quietly, not daring to breathe too loudly, as if speaking too much might shatter the fragile connection. For a long moment, the office ceased to exist. There were no boundaries, no expectations, only the warmth of her hand in mine and the shared understanding that we were venturing into something new, delicate, and profoundly human. In that quiet crossing of lines, the world felt both safer and more dangerous than ever. By the time we returned to our desks, my hands still tingled from the touch. The subtle intimacy of that moment lingered, a quiet echo that neither of us could ignore. Something had shifted irrevocably. Our connection had become tangible, and I knew there was no going back to the way things were before. The office was quiet that evening, the soft hum of fluorescent lights blending with the faint tapping of distant keyboards. Most people had left, leaving just the two of us in a space that suddenly felt far too intimate to be considered ordinary. We were side by side at a small desk, the glow of the lamp casting gentle shadows across her face, highlighting the subtle warmth in her eyes. I could feel the weight of the day pressing down, but more than that, I could feel the unspoken tension between us, the delicate thread that had been building for days now pulling taut. She spoke first, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I've never let anyone get this close to me," she admitted, and for a moment the words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. Her eyes searched mine, not demanding, not expecting, simply offering the truth she had kept carefully guarded. I realized then how much courage it must have taken, how deeply personal that admission was, and my chest tightened with a mixture of admiration and longing. "I've been drawn to you since the first day," I whispered, my voice betraying more than I intended. I could feel the tremor in my own words, the vulnerability I had tried to hide, and yet it felt right to let it out, to finally acknowledge what I had been holding in. Her lips curved into a soft, almost shy smile, and I could see the relief in her eyes, the way she leaned slightly closer, as if the confession had bridged a gap that had existed between us for far too long. There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding, the kind that only emerges after trust has been earned and walls have been carefully lowered. Her hand found mine again, this time without hesitation, fingers interlacing with a natural ease that made my heart race. The warmth of her palm, the gentle pressure of her thumb brushing over mine, conveyed more than words ever could. "I didn't think I'd feel this way, at my age," she said softly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "And yet, here you are." There was no embarrassment in her tone, only honesty, a raw and tender acknowledgement of the connection between us. I smiled, feeling the same mix of awe and exhilaration she must have felt. "And yet, here I am too," I said, voice low, carrying the weight of truth and longing. We stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads almost touching, breaths mingling, hands still intertwined. The world outside the office ceased to exist. Time seemed to stretch and bend, giving us a space entirely our own, a space where vulnerability, desire, and tenderness could coexist without judgment. Every heartbeat felt synchronized, every glance a quiet promise that we were navigating this together. Finally, she leaned closer, resting her head lightly against my chest. I felt the rise and fall of her breathing, the warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. I wrapped my arms around her shoulders gently, holding her close, and in that embrace, everything that had been left unspoken found its place. We didn't need grand declarations or dramatic gestures. The honesty in that quiet confession was enough to transform the tension of days into a shared, undeniable connection. By the time we pulled back, our eyes met, shimmering with something both fragile and eternal. We had crossed the invisible line of hesitation, stepping into something profound and deeply human. And in that moment I knew that whatever came next, it would be built on honesty, trust, and a warmth that neither of us had expected, but both had longed for. The office was nearly empty, bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the blinds. The quiet hum of computers and distant street noise formed a gentle background to a moment that felt suspended outside of time. After the confessions, the air between us was no longer charged with tension or unspoken questions. Instead, it was filled with warmth, safety, and a quiet intimacy that neither of us had anticipated but both had longed for. She leaned in slightly as we gathered our things, brushing her fingers along mine one last time before letting go. The gesture wasn't dramatic, yet it carried all the weight of the trust and connection we had built. My chest felt light and heavy at once, the strange paradox of exhilaration and contentment settling over me. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to analyze or restrain myself. I just existed in the space between us, letting the moment unfold naturally. "I don't want this to end," she whispered softly, her head tilting slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability that took my breath away. I felt the pull of her words, the unspoken invitation that lingered like a fragile thread. "It doesn't have to," I said, my voice calm but carrying the depth of everything I felt. I stepped closer, careful yet deliberate, bridging the remaining space. Her arms looped gently around my waist, and I responded instinctively, wrapping my arms around her shoulders, holding her close in a way that felt both protective and tender. Her cheek rested lightly against my chest, and I felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the subtle warmth radiating from her body. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The office, the work, the rules, all of it melted away, leaving just the two of us in a cocoon of quiet intimacy. We stayed like that for minutes that felt like hours, simply holding each other, feeling the rhythm of two hearts slowly aligning. Her fingers traced the curve of my back lightly, and I felt a shiver of comfort and desire that had nothing to do with urgency, and everything to do with connection. There was no rush, no pressure, just the gentle affirmation of presence, of acceptance, of mutual understanding. Finally, she lifted her head slightly, her eyes searching mine with a tender, almost shy curiosity. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering against her skin just long enough to feel the softness, the warmth, the living reality of her being close to me. "I think this is the beginning of something real," I said quietly. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit her entire face, and nodded. "Yes, something real." We walked out of the office together, side by side, fingers brushing occasionally, hearts light yet full of the gravity of shared emotions. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet, human satisfaction of being truly seen, truly accepted, and truly cherished. It was the culmination of days of tension, longing, and subtle connection, resolved in the simplest, most profound way: warmth, presence, and affection that spoke louder than words ever could. That night, as I reflected on the days that had led here, I realized that slow-burn romance wasn't about explosive passion or fleeting thrills. It was about patience, trust, and the quiet accumulation of moments that, when pieced together, created a bond deeper than either of us had expected. And as I thought of her, still so close in my memory, I knew that this was just the beginning of a story that neither of us would ever forget.